We happy? Vincent? We happy?
Yeah, we happy.
So time to talk about this, the Intel 13900K, and Intel has pretty much created a mini ThreadRipper.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I break your concentration?
This guy here has 24 cores and 33 threads. Obviously some of them are, P cores and some of them E cores. And is it worth for creators, and how good is it? Well, that's exactly why you're here. And also, what else is here is this sponsored segment.
Looking for a cheap way to license your Windows? Check out WhoKeys through the links in the video description. Make sure to use the code TN20 to get a 30% off. Paste the license to the activation settings and you're all done. This license is for Windows 10, but you can upgrade it to Windows 11 for free. They also offer Microsoft Office 19 license. Use the same code TN20 to get a 30% off. Check out WhoKeys.com in the video description below.
So in this video, we're going to be comparing the top two generations of AMD and Intel to really see if this is worth it. Now, I'm also going to be testing right now the 13600K in this test bench, and you should be very excited about that video. That video comes out in 2 days. So stay tuned for that, hit that subscribe button. So first of all, to look at this processor, we need to look at the specs and how does it compare in the market, okay? So this really competes with the best that's out there from AMD and Intel. So if you're looking at the 13900K, 12900K, 7950X and 5950X, we can see that the core count obviously is quite a bit different on the 13900K. Now, interestingly, the P cores remained the same, but we gained 8 efficiency cores. So now we have 16 efficiency cores compared to 8 efficiency cores on the 12900K. The 7950X has 16 performance cores and 32 threads like the usual cores, but the efficiency cores on the 12th gen and 13th gen, just so you know, have 1 thread per core, but the usual cores that AMD have, the performance cores, have 2 threads per core. That's why we have 32 threads, and the same with 5950X. In terms of the clock speeds, the max turbo frequency the 13900K can reach is 5.8 gigahertz. The 12900K is 5.2 gigahertz, so we've gained about 0.6 gigahertz. The 7950X is just shy of 100 megahertz at 5.7 gigahertz, and compared to the 5950X, which is 4.9 gigahertz. The 13th and 12th gen both support PCIe Gen 5, and so does the 7950X, but the 5950X is Gen 4. In terms of the PCIe lanes, which is a very interesting thing, not a lot of people talk about it, the 13th and the 12th gen have 20 PCIe Gen 5 lanes, but the 7950X has 24 lanes, which is 4 lanes extra, which means you can basically get a secondary M.2 PCIe Gen 4 X4 slot directly connected to the CPU. Bear in mind, these are usable PCIe lanes. It actually has 28, which I think goes to the chipset, but usable are 24. In terms of RAM, the 13th gen and 12th gen both support DDR4 and DDR5, which makes the RAM selection very, very affordable. So if you get like a Z690 motherboard with the 13th gen, you can still use DDR4. The 7950X only supports DDR5 and the 5950X only DDR4. In terms of L3 cache, the 13900K has 36 megabytes compared to 30 megabytes on the 12900K and 64 megabytes on the 7950X, which is basically double the amount what 13900K has. But the L2 cache, you can see, is 32 megabytes compared to the 14 megabytes on the 12900K and 16 megabytes on the 7950X. So the 13900K has 16 megabytes extra, or double the L2 cache compared to the Ryzen 9 7950X. In terms of the TDP or base power, Intel spec is 125 watts, which is the same as 12900K, but these measurements need to be set in the motherboard BIOS. As you can see, the turbo frequency 13900K can push over 300 watts from the CPU compared to the 220 watts on the 12900K. And the 7950X pulls about 230 watts. That's just the normal, power draw. But if you enable precision boost overdrive, then you're going to see over 230 watts plus pull 250 and even more depending on your motherboard settings. 5950X is the most power efficient here in terms of just, you know, multi-core utilization. 130 watts at full belt, and then if you enable PBO, you can see like 180, 190, something around there. In terms of iGPU, the 13th gen has exactly the same iGPU, which is very good for the videographers. We're gonna get to that in a moment. But so has the 7950X, which has the Radeon graphics with 2 cores, but the 5950X doesn't have any integrated graphics. In terms of the process node, the 13900K is exactly the same process as the 12900K, which is 10 nanometers, or as Intel calls it, Intel 7, which is really 10 nanometers. In terms of 7950X, that runs 5 nanometers, but the 5950X is 7 nanometers. Just a quick note about the memory controller, which has also been changed on the 13th gen. It now supports up to 5600 megatransfers per second compared to 48 megatransfers per second on the 12th gen. Now that is per channel. If you want to populate 4 sticks, what Intel doesn't actually tell you is that then it supports up to 4000 megatransfers per second. Now you could get it working, you know, so on with some XMP and manual things if you configure and overclock RAM manually, but you're not gonna get XMP working with 4 sticks even on the 13th gen above 4000 megatransfers per second. So they don't tell you this, you can't find it from Arc, but I actually fished it out from my Intel contact, so that's the deal there. Not as bad as AMD, which goes to 3200 megatransfers per second with 4 sticks of DDR5, but still would like to see, you know, more than 4000 megatransfers per second, but we have to wait for the memory controllers to mature a bit more. But one of the very important things after the specs is the price, because we want to know, is it worth the extra performance and how does it compare in the market? So right now I'm looking at the CPU prices on Newegg, if they're on sale there. The 13900K comes at $659, which is quite a hefty price, but we'll have to look at what's the competition because it is like the top of the line, right? The 12900K runs at $480. The 7950X is $699, so actually more expensive than the 13900K, and the 5950X is $548. In terms of the motherboard costs, I'm taking exactly the same brand of motherboard, just the different chipsets, right? So the Z690 ProArt costs $449 right now, and bear in mind there will be at some point coming out a Z790 ProArt as well, but we'll see what the pricing of that is. There's more features, but you can easily get the Z690 ProArt as well, just so you know. But the X670E ProArt motherboard for the Ryzen 7000 costs $500, which is $50 extra. And then the X570 is actually EOL, but if you do want to get exactly the same, it's $658, which is the more expensive ones just because there aren't any on the market available right now. You can get another different motherboard which will be cheaper, but you're gonna lose some of the features that you would have, like a 10 gigabit Ethernet and so on. But I would still recommend you go with some other X570 chipsets, but just if we compare exactly the same, that's the price. In terms of RAM, 64 gigabytes of DDR5 will cost $302, and that will go across 12th and 13th gen as well as the Ryzen 7000, but DDR4 will cost $252 for the same brand of RAM, just DDR4 and 3600 MHz CL18. So in total, the 12900K is $180 less, or 12.7% cheaper. The 7950X is $89 more expensive and 6.3% more expensive. The 5950X, with the weird pricing of the motherboard right now, comes $48 more expensive, which is 3.4% more expensive. So now we have to see if the price increase is bigger or lower than the performance increase, or is the price increase going to match the performance increase. So the test setup, what parts are we using? For the AMD, we're using Asus X670E ProArt Create Wi-Fi. For the RAM, we're using 32 gigabytes DDR5, 5200 megatransfers per second Kingston Fury Beast RGB. and that's the same for the Intel's 12th and 13th gen. In terms of GPU, that's all the same across the board, which is Asus TUF RTX 3090. The cooler on the AMD is Asus ROG Strix LC2 360mm AIO, plus I've replaced the fans with 3 Fantex T30 fans, and I've done exactly the same on the Intel system, except the cooler is the Fantex Glacier 1, but they're exactly the same cooler, just different brands because they're both Acertec coolers actually. So the actual cooling performance is exactly the same, and I'm using the same T30 fans. In terms of the OS drive on AMD, we're using the Cardia C440 1TB drive for the OS drive, and the project drive is MSI M80 Spatium 2TB drive. On the Intel, the OS SSD is Samsung 980 Pro 1TB drive, and for the project drive, we're using Samsung 980 Pro 2TB drive. The PSU on the AMD is Corsair HX 1000. On the Intel, we're using Deepcool BQ 1000M power supply. On the Ryzen 5000, we're using Asus X570 Pro at motherboard, 2x 32GB Kingston Fury Renegade RGB RAM at 3600 mega transfers per second and CL18. The cooler is Noctua NHD15. I know you might be saying it's not as good as the liquid coolers. Believe me, for that processor, that cooler is way enough. For OS, we're using the same Cardia C440 as on the other AMD system, and the 2TB FireCuda 530 for the project drive where all the benchmark assets are on. In terms of the PSU, we're using Fractal Iron Plus 2 860 watt power supply. Power consumption, first of all. Now, bear in mind, this is very much limited to your motherboard, and most likely a motherboard's going to pull much more than the Intel's limit at, 253 watts. For example, if you pull it to any of the Asus board, it's going to boost to much more. What I've seen and what you can see on the screen is that the 3900K pulls around 300 watts from the socket. The Ryzen 7950X pulls 233 watts from the socket without PBO enabled. The 12900K pulls 221 watts, and the 5950X 130 watts. Now, that 330 watts is a lot of power and runs very hot as well. Right here, we need to kind of change our thinking about the temperatures of the CPU, because AMD and Intel, actually the latest generations, have changed the way the temperatures work. So basically, if you don't use Intel's recommended, power settings like 253 watts and 125 watts, base power and so on, what will happen and what the motherboard will do is it's going to push the CPU to the absolute maximum, to that TJ max, which is 100C on Intel CPUs, and it's going to keep that power there as long as it can. If it starts to reach the TJ max, then it's going to pull the clock speeds down. That way, it's just going to maximize the performance of the CPU. And we can see exactly the same with AMD 7000 series CPUs, where they're going to keep it at 95 watts. And it doesn't matter really what cooling you're going to use, it's still going to reach there. And it's going to keep it at that temperatures. So it's absolutely ridiculous to see that. And your PC is going to be very loud. And I think it's going to be time we tune the PC with those little microphone header or sensors, where we can actually say, look, I don't want my PC to go above 40 decibels or something like that, which will be very helpful. But I do want to mention the other side as well, which is that 100% power, like 315 watts, won't be pulled all the time. That's when the CPU is 100% utilized. And even you or me as a creator, we are not going to see that unless we're going to be pulling or doing a blender cycle or something like that where we're 100% rendering. Even at video export, you won't see it 100% utilized. That's just the very worst case of scenario. And I'm going to make another video about the average power consumption. Stick around for that. First of all, Cinebench R23, just so we see how does the CPU rendering and where do the CPU slot and how much different they are to each other. The 3900K has reached the highest single core speed there at Cinebench R23 at 2170. The multi-core score is 40,267. Let's just put it in perspective how ridiculous that speed is, right? The Ryzen ThreadRipper 3960X will score 34,000 score. That's just absolutely ridiculous. And as you can see, that's what Intel has created, a mini ThreadRipper here. The Ryzen 7950X is 7% slower in the single core speeds and roughly about 6.2% slower in the multi-core speeds. The 12900K is 8% slower in the single core speeds, but about 32% slower in the multi-core speeds. And 5950X is 27% slower in the single core speeds and about 37% slower in the multi-core speeds. In Geekbench 5, which is very just generic kind of benchmarks, and that will really show how fast and snappy the CPU is doing a lot of different everyday tasks, file compressing, all sorts of things that the CPU can do. A lot of benchmarks, not so much in-depth, but very, very shallow, and all of them together. Single core speed is literally exactly the same on 7950X in my test bench, which is absolutely ridiculous, by a single point exactly the same. The multi-core score though on Ryzen is 10% slower, roughly 9.2% slower, but I do want to mention that Geekbench doesn't actually count the threads per core, it's only core performance, and that's why Intel will have a little bit of a lead because it has more cores compared to the Ryzen 7950X. The 12900K is about 12% slower in the single core speed and 30% slower in the multi-core speeds. The 5950X is 25% slower in the single core speed and about 33% slower in the multi-core speed. Moving on to Blender and 3D performance, we can see that the 13900K is absolutely ridiculous and has gained a lot of performance since the 12900K. We're 36% faster in the monster scene, we're about 40% faster in the junk shop scene, and about 35% faster in the classroom scene. The 7950X is absolutely another animal and is still 2 to 3% faster in the Blender, in the monster, chunk shop and classroom scene. So if you do want 3D monster, then the 7950X actually beats the 13900K here. Now I don't have the 5950X benchmark for this, but I do have the M1 Ultra from Apple benchmark for this, and that's very interesting here. The monster scene is 33% slower on the M1 Ultra, junk shop scene is about 39% slower, and the classroom is about the same, 39% slower compared to the 13900K. Moving on to photo editing and Photoshop. The Ryzen 7950X is 9% slower in the overall score. The general score is about 14% slower, but we have gained about 13% since the 12th gen, 12900K. And the 5950X is about 20% slower than the 13900K. Moving on to Lightroom Classic, the 7950X is about 7% slower and the 12900K is about 13% slower. The 5950X is about 32% slower, and that's due to the single core performance, because Lightroom likes that a lot. But also if you look at the passive score, then the passive score is really, really impressive here. All of these different cores can actually export these photos faster and put them together and merge them and do panoramas. As you can see, the 13900K is about 6% faster than the 7950X and about 16% faster than the 12900K. Let's move on to video editing performance, and here I do want to say that the Ryzen 7950X had a little bit of an issue with some of the benchmarks. Pretty much half of the scores ran about 30% slower and then 30% higher, which is, I don't know why. Maybe there's some kind of issue with the iGPU and DGPU at the same time and it can't kind of figure out which decoders and encoders to use. But the overall results are the average of the best and the worst results. You see the extended live playback score compared to the 5950X and the 7950X, then the 5950X actually scores a little bit higher, but actually in the actual benchmarks, they're pretty much exactly the same in terms of the scores. But looking at the extended overall score, the 13900K is 20% faster than the 7950X. Now, if you have two options for Premiere Pro, it's quite a clear choice which one you should go here between AMD and Intel, because it is still a lot faster. As you can see, the 12900K is still about 12% faster than the 7950X, but most of it is due to the standard and extended live playback score. As you can see, the extended live playback score on the 13900K is about 35% faster, and the standard live playback score is almost double the performance. So about 47% faster there. And that's due to the iGPU inside the CPU, which was actually the same on the 12th gen. As you can see, the 12900K is also much faster than the 7950X in the extended and standard live playback speeds, because it can use the decoders or media engines inside the CPU. Compared to the 12900K, we're about 8% faster in the extended overall score and about the same in the standard overall score. So the performance increase isn't actually that big. We see a big increase in the export scores. Here, the standard export is about 18% faster, and the extended export score is about 14% faster. And that's due to the actual, we've got more cores and we can utilize these cores. So that's faster. And also the effect scores are a bit faster. Compared to the 5950X, the 13900K is 23% faster in the extended overall score and about the same in the standard overall score. Interestingly, even though we're using the same GPU, the 7950X is about 4.5% slower in the GPU score compared to the 13900K. Let's move on to After Effects, and here we're seeing a little bit of a bigger difference between 7950X, which is 12% slower in the overall score and about 11% slower in the multi-core score. The RAM preview is about 12% slower, even though we're using exactly the same RAM and exactly the same RAM speeds, which is quite a big difference. The tracking is about 13% slower on the 7950X. The 12900K is about 14% slower in the overall score, but the multi-core score is 28% slower, which is quite a big increase. And compared to the 5950X, we're 29% faster now on the 13900K. In DaVinci Resolve here, now we have some interesting results. The 7950X and 13900K are pretty much neck to neck and within the margin of error between them two. Now, the thing here is that the Intel still has a slight edge, which doesn't actually show in this benchmark, which is the iGPU. And I highly recommend you to take off your NVIDIA encoders and decoders and only use Intel QuickSync or Intel integrated graphics, because the Intel media engines support more codecs than the actual NVIDIA graphics, which in my case is the RTX 3090. So both of these CPUs are very, very high end, but I would still lean towards the 13900K if you do a lot of H.264 and 5 codecs editing, because you'll get much better timeline playback and encoding and export on the 13900K. But if you do a lot of raw video editing, then the 7950X is probably a better pick there. If you do a mix of both, then I'd still stick with Intel, just because if you come across H.264 and 5, you don't need to do proxies or whatever. It can just breeze through them very, very smoothly. We have gained about 9% in extended score and about 7% in the standard overall score compared to the 12900K. The 5950X is about 28% slower in the extended overall score and about 30% slower in the standard overall score. And the last thing is V-Ray, which is about 7% faster in the 7950X. Like I mentioned, the Ryzen 7950X is amazing at 3D and will beat the 13900K. And the 12900K is actually about 35% slower compared to the 13900K, which is a massive increase in the 13th gen. The 5950X is about 27% slower compared to the 13900K. Is the 13900K worth it over the Ryzen 7950X? Now, I would say unless you're doing 3D specifically in the CPU rendering part, then the 7950X is the only kind of workflow that I would recommend over the Intel side. Anything else, the Intel is a much better performer and bang for buck. As you can see, even the price is a little bit cheaper, motherboards are cheaper, everything is cheaper, but we get more performance, especially in the photo and video editing applications. And I do want to underline that one more time. If you're using Premiere Pro or even DaVinci Resolve, in fact, H.265 and H.264 codecs, that Intel iGPU inside there, the UHD 770 with 2 media encoders inside, is absolutely a game changer compared to the competition like AMD Ryzen 7950X. And AMD is sitting on a ton of performance, but it just needs to be figured out in the software, because the iGPU there has decoders there as well, but they just haven't worked with Adobe and DaVinci Resolve to actually utilize these together with the DGPU decoders and so on. So there is a bit of performance on the table for AMD, but right now the Intel is a much better pick. So if you do want the best build processor possible for creators, then the 13900K is the one to get. In fact, it's much cheaper than the competition and performs even better. Bear in mind the 3D application performance there. There is another thing, which is the cooling and 300 plus watts pulled from the socket. Now, you could set the limits to the Intel stock. You'll lose a little bit of performance in the multi-core speeds, but I don't think for most people this is a big issue. Now, the downside of it is that if you don't configure your fan curves, they will run much louder because it just thinks the CPU is overheating, even though the motherboard is letting the CPU run as close to that TJ max as possible to get the ultimate performance out from the CPU and don't leave any on the table. Now, yes, it does run hot. It's a little bit louder, but with a little bit of fan curve tuning, I'm optimistic about that because I'd much rather have that performance than actually just less wattage pulled out there as well and leave some kind of performance on the table just because we're so much further from the TJ Max. But I am slightly concerned about the next generation because are we going to pull even more than this? Because what are we going to do? Like, are we going to run liquid nitrogen inside our PCs then just to cool them down? Which is slightly worrying to me. I think at this point we can still kind of manage that 300 watts, and that's why I said it's a mini ThreadRipper, because we've actually exceeded the ThreadRipper in performance and power consumption on a tiny chip. In fact, the ThreadRipper at 280 watts will run much cooler than this guy over here. Now, if you do want to check out the latest pricing of the CPU or my test bench setup, I'm going to leave the links in the description below where you can just purchase it. Go check it out. But if you can't afford the 13900K, just wait till the 13600K review, because now, wow, that is impressive. Okay, wait for that. If you're here and you want to build yourself a best bang for buck PC, then go check out my best bang for buck create a PC build guide in the description below. There's a 4-part video series where you can pick up the video that's closest to your budget and then configure it to your budget to get the best performance for your money. You can configure it from $750 all the way to $5,000. Go and check those videos out. But until then, I'll see you in the next one. See you in the 13600K review. Bye bye.